William, hopefully your favorite videographer from Two Hats Publishing. I welcome you to another Two Hats special of community events. Let's look in and see what's really happening.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance Hard Conversation. I'm Cindy Crane with the Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance, and before we get started, I want to acknowledge I've got I think a couple of board members of Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance. I saw Ikena Mobo, Metro Care Services. Is there anyone else in the house? And I saw Ken Webb, who is the chair of the new City of Dallas Citizens Advisory Commission on Homelessness here. In addition, there's a lot of excellent CEOs and case managers and providers from all across the Metroplex. And I'm very excited to have you all here.
Great op-ed in the paper.
Did it? Thank you. Oh, if you're in some of the emails I got, that's part of it. I mean, you put yourself out there. Right? Homelessness is a very hard conversation to have. And many of us have an opinion or an experience or a lived experience or ideas. And all those voices have value. And I am not the only voice. I represent a lot of myself and a lot of my own experience. And when we started this ongoing series on the experiences of homelessness and impacts of homelessness and why for of homelessness in the Hard Conversation speaker series, that was the point. And I'm really excited about some of the hard things we've addressed. We've talked about racism and homelessness. We've talked about the victimization of women in homelessness. We've talked about the opinions people have on panhandling and unsheltered homelessness and addiction and homelessness. And now we're, and I've really thought that it was important. A lot of us would go to conferences. And so one person gets an airfare and dinner gets to go away to a different city and learn a lot. And how do we bring that back to our local community? And one of the ideas we had at MDHA, I can bring one person here to Dallas that I heard at one of these conferences that meant something to me, that I wanted to share their expertise and their talent with Dallas, that was a really good use of our money. And what I'm really excited today is to introduce a woman I met in 2012, I think in Kansas City, at my very first Healthcare for the Homeless National Council Symposium and Public Policy Forum. Most of us in homelessness go to something called the National Alliance to End Homelessness Conference. And I got an email about this Healthcare for the Homeless thing. And I read it and I said, this looks like a really different view than a typical HUD view or housing view. And I began to learn so much, became a member of the organization, have built wonderful alliances to learn really the whole holistic approach to homelessness, examining the multiple barriers and health implications of homelessness. And one of the most dynamic people I met was Dr. Barbara DiPietro, and I've been able to also become a part of that leadership team. Going to Nashville for a leadership meeting in October. I didn't get to go this year because of Harvey and Texas Homeless Network. But to really, as leaders and people who have really committed our careers and our lives to this issue, to come together kind of as a small group in a quiet place and commiserate and talk and get re-energized, because we deal with a very, very complex and different topic. And so this is her chance to kind of get out of the typical public policy, public health world and kind of talk about her perspective over 15 years. She has a public policy background, and she also works in the Baltimore, Maryland Healthcare for the Homeless Clinic, and of which we have something similar through Parkland Hospital Homes Program. And she also is a senior policy advisor for the Healthcare for the Homeless National Council. And so it's all about her. She's going to really give her perspective, her ideas, her vision, and her thoughts. And then we're going to have a chance to question and answer and get some of your views. So welcome, Barbara DiPietro.
Let's see if I can make the technology work. Is this working?
Oh, yes, it is, yeah. I'm going to get out from in front of the podium a little bit. Thank you so much for having me here. I had heard that there were 275 people who registered for this, which I think in and of itself really says a lot about this community and your interest in just talking about the issue of homelessness, which I think is a hard issue because there are so many facets that bring out our passions. And when people are impassioned, that's when the real fun begins, right? And so I just want to thank Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance for having me here. I do want to emphasize that I flew coach to get here, so very important in these times to illustrate. Very portable. And so also, I know that you've had a number of issues that have been presented to you in this forum that are really important. And so I think a lot of these all thread together. I don't think anything is disconnected from one another. But one of the tips, I was watching actually the video from a previous piece that you had on racism where Jeff Olivet had mentioned, put your Twitter information on the cover slide in case people like to tweet things during this talk. So here's my information, here's my organization's information if this is something that you do. If not, totally fine. But let's just plunge in because I want to talk a lot about some different things that I've been seeing and maybe put together a few things. And then I want to kind of pull all of it together, but then I want to hear what you think of this, because I feel like there's a different conversation that we need to be having in this country, but in our local communities about the issue of homelessness. So first things first, I don't think we can end homelessness by ending homelessness. And it's a little bit of something to wrap your head around, but I think this needs to start being a mantra, particularly for those of us who are in the homelessness industry. So a little bit about my organization, the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. We primarily do training and technical assistance for healthcare for the homeless providers to try to spread best practices in homeless healthcare. That's what we do. We try to get people who are serving homeless folks to do that in the best way possible. But one of the things that's really clear to me is that homelessness itself isn't the problem. And we address so much of our energy into addressing homelessness as the problem. We frame our public policies and our crisis solutions around homelessness as the problem. But I don't think that's the problem. Let me see if, oh, very good, this has a pointer. My apologies if folks can't see. Is this in any way clear to you on this side of the room that you can see slides? Okay. Homelessness is an outgrowth of poverty. And poverty, I think, is the problem in this country. And we have a number of things that come together to create homelessness. But I think it's important for us also to know, I think that homelessness is a conscious decision that we've made in this country and in our community. We've chosen to have homelessness in this country. And public policy decisions that create and perpetuate homelessness are the kinds of things that are the problem. And I think also, so we need to kind of come at it from maybe coming back up off of the ground where we're saying homelessness is the problem, maybe coming up to like this 50,000 foot level and saying maybe there's a bigger problem. And poverty is the problem. And we've got over 40 million people in this country living below poverty. And I think that's a problem. Very, very, very few people experiencing homelessness are independently wealthy. And so, I mean, I'm curious here, how many people do direct service with clients? Okay, great. So you probably know that not many of your clients are like rolling in cash. So this is the issue. And I think one of the things that's the issue too is that homeless service providers, this is the stuff that consumes our daily work. We are so focused on trying to put the pieces together to create a homeless crisis system. And this is where we spend our days prioritizing people on a list, asking them 100 questions about, okay, well, are you sick enough to get housing? Well, I'm so sorry, ma'am. If just you were sicker, or if you're just disabled, or if you had this condition or that, and we create like these systems around it. But we're fighting for vouchers, and we're trying to collect data, we're trying to establish best practices, and we're putting all of this, our energy, into the thing that isn't the problem to begin with. And one of the things that I think, and I feel here is, and the small print here isn't important. What's important here is that we're creating this homelessness industrial complex where we're solidifying structures around the thing that's not the problem. So we're solidifying what does an evidence-based practice look like for prioritizing people for housing. To me, that's madness. How is it that we're getting really wrapped into what is the definition of a chronic homeless? I love the federal definition of chronic homelessness. Like, how many people have read the federal definition of homelessness? Right? How many pages does it take to define homelessness and really set up specific check boxes that you've got to fit in? And I just don't feel like that's I don't feel like that's a good way to characterize human beings because we don't fit into boxes. None of us do. However, we're creating systems around these very definitions. And I think that's what consumes us. We're creating off-ramps, and we're creating, again, what does rapid rehousing best practices look like, and who qualifies and who doesn't? And there's a never-ending process to that. The problem is that it never ends, right? So it feels to me like in the homeless service world, we're being asked to empty out the tub with a teaspoon, and no one is turning off the faucet. So if we want to prioritize 50 people or 100 people or 150 people this year who meet chronic definition, who meet all the criteria, we've managed to get the vouchers, and we can get frequent users and all of this, right? And we can get them into housing, and that is fantastic. And I am not belittling the work that any of us are doing in this room because that is yeoman's work. But next year, there's going to be 150 more people in the tub. And it continues. And this isn't new. And so one of the things that I think is important is it feels like the conversation's coming to a pitch. It feels like a lot of conversations are coming to this escalating piece. We've been addressing endemic homelessness in this country for 30 years, and we haven't managed to figure out how to stop it. And maybe even a more accurate way of saying this, we do know actually how to stop it. We just have chosen not to in our public policies. But we've got to figure out how to turn off that tap, because maybe it'd be easier for us to empty out the tub and keep the tub empty. That's what ending homelessness is. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things here. And people say, best practices in doing speeches, you should just have 3 main points. So we have 3 points in 3 parts each. And then as I started thinking about this, I was like, brought to you by the letter 3. So, 3. Okay. A little humor. Okay. So let's talk today about 3 root causes to homelessness. Like, what are the real problems? Where do I see barriers to just addressing these problems? And then what are some of the things that we can do as a community to try to overcome this? And then let's talk about what you think about this pairing. Okay, first, I think housing, healthcare, and income are the 3 biggest causes of homelessness. We have systemic failures in all 3 of these areas. And this doesn't even get to racism, the education system, or the corrections system, which again, we've got lots of issues across the board. But let's focus on 3. First, so about 30 years ago, the Institute of Medicine did a seminal report on homelessness. And this was in the 80s when homelessness was really coming up on the radar screen. And we were seeing more and more people, coupled with a disinvestment in housing and deinstitutionalization and a number of other things, producing more people on the street. And they found 3 things. Poor health can make you homeless. Homelessness can make you sick or sicker. And then the experience of homelessness complicates treatment. And as homeless healthcare providers, we see this every day. It's very hard to keep people healthy when they're living on the street or in a shelter or in unstable situations. We've got a lot of issues in this country with regard to insurance. And it feels like even talking about insurance is a political issue now. And this is a supercharged piece. But we have to talk about the fact that we've got some sick people we're trying to take care of. We've got a lot of issues with insurance in this country, also here in Texas, I'm sorry to say. But even when you have insurance, it might be still unaffordable. You might still not be able to get what you need, or get where you need to go, or have a hard time getting there and putting together all the pieces. So it's not a one solution issue. And yet people continue to get sick, and they continue to use the hospitals, the jails, the EMS, all the things that we know. I can't come to Texas and not talk about Medicaid. I just can't. So indulge me for a slide here, but I think It's kind of thing where we need health coverage. It pays for the care. Curiously, Texas turns down $100 billion in a 10-year period by not taking the expansion. And there's a lot of conversation around this and passionate pieces about, Medicaid and whether it is or isn't or this, that, or the other. The fact is that we need some coverage to help pay for care. And a lot of people are going without this, and it is specifically inefficient. I've kind of been looking through your local paper recently. 50% of Dallas County property taxes go to pay Parkland's uncompensated care. And I'm just so sure that there's something else you'd like to see happen in your community besides paying for again, we all pay for system failures. I mean, I think it's a community issue. There are two really good reports that have just come out that if you want to Google these, Kaiser Family Foundation, they literally took almost, I think it's 153 reports and put them all together in one big list to talk about the effects of Medicaid expansion. And then the National Health Law Program, it's got a really great 50 reasons why this is great for your state. If you want to get this and send it to everybody you know, that would be super cool. Okay, enough of Medicaid. But at the same time, we also are in a discussion about data and return on investment. And it feels odd to me that I have to demonstrate a cost savings on a human being in order to give them what I think is a human right. And I feel like I have to say that my bank didn't ask me about my health conditions when they gave me a loan. And I'm pretty sure I'd be indignant if they did. So I feel like there's a conversation here about this idea of the business case. Now we're making it, and hats off to Cindy Crane because she has been pushing the data piece and trying to frame how we are making the case for what we need. And so I think it's really hard work. It requires a lot of systems and structures. But again, these are the systems and structures we've chosen because we have created them. Homelessness is a man-made problem. Harvey is not. Homelessness is. So I think, again, we have to make the business case. I just think it's important to say, that feels a little odd to me. And then we talk a lot about personal responsibility in this country. And I feel like it's usually it's either personal responsibility or it's a systemic problem. And it's both. Why can't we talk about it? Things don't have to be so polarized. But it's more than individual responsibility. Social determinants of health. Our health behaviors are about 30% of our health outcomes. But things like housing and access to food and access to jobs and things like that are actually more important in how healthy we are than whether we choose to smoke. I think that's fascinating and something we need to talk about. And actually, clinical care itself is a smaller piece. So I think we just need to talk more about what goes into this. And we have to recognize that we still have critical flaws in our system. We still have a lot of stigma on behavioral health. It's a real barrier to people acknowledging problems, getting treatment for problems, and we have systemic issues in getting access to treatment. Okay, that was a lot on health. Move on to housing. I don't think I need to talk to anybody about a shortage of housing, but here's, I think, a few numbers that are just important to keep in our rubric, right? Is that we don't have enough low-income housing for people to afford. There is a disconnect between what housing costs and the money that people have to pay for housing. So let's talk about how we bridge that gap, but it doesn't negate the fact of the matter. And we also have about 25% of people who qualify for housing assistance in this country actually receive it. So we have a lot of unmet need. Again, I think this is something that we know. And then there was just a worst case housing needs reports to Congress that HUD put out. There's over 8 million households that are very low income, pay more than half their income on rent. We know that this almost 8.5 million households, those are the at-risk folks. Those are the folks coming into the tub. That's the problem. And this isn't new, right? So when we look at the disinvestment in housing since 1975, this is not new. This has been happening in every administration, regardless of letter. This is an endemic nationwide problem, and it started under Carter. So this isn't a Republican or Democrat kind of thing. Sure, it's been fueled in different areas, in better or worse ways, but this is not new. Just some stats you probably are already aware of, but in Texas, when we talk about minimum wages, we talk a lot about, we need to get to $10.10, or we need to get $15 an hour. But when we look at actual, again, what people earn and what housing costs, we're talking about a minimum wage that we know is not feasible in most places, given the political discussion that goes around this, and a lot of other things too. So again, we just have to figure out, how do we bridge this gap? And then here is a great chart, I love this. This is the number of hours that you need to work in every state at minimum wage in order to afford a one-bedroom apartment and not spend more than 30% of your income on that rent. And Texas is at 82 hours a week. And it is tied with Florida, so that's cool, for the highest, well, not the highest in the country, actually Hawaii and some other places, but it's pretty high, and it's actually the dark greens are the highest. Okay, that's housing income. I want to come back to a graph that we had before. We got a lot of poor folks in this country that can't afford housing. I think that has got to be said. And then at this point, I actually want to give you just a short break from me. I want to play a video. The only reason and people are probably thinking, oh God, a video. It's 6 minutes. I think you'll like it. Part of why I chose to put it into this discussion is that we are going to be having a discussion about tax reform in this country in the next several months. Maybe the next several years. We don't know what this looks like. But this is an opportunity for us to learn how our income is distributed in this country. And where does it go? I think a lot of people, just want to know, where do my taxes go? And so I think that this is an important conversation, and this video will give us some background to it. And I'm hoping that
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 20% groups. They asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are. Teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Okay, thank you for indulging in that. And one of the things I think that's important here is just, again, understanding where tax money goes and how income is distributed. We're going to hear a lot in the news in the next weeks and months about where taxes need to go and what a reform package looks like and where we think that should be as a country. And I think that's a hard discussion to have. When you start talking about who gets money, everybody has a very strong opinion about that. So it's important just to be honest. Okay, so that was health and housing and income. So here are 3 things that I think are barriers for us having real discussions about what the solutions are to some of the problems here that produce homelessness. I think we're super polarized to the point where we can't talk to one another anymore. I think we're really unhappy as a country, and I think that we're angry and we're blaming each other. And I'm just not sure that this is where we want to be or what's going to help us have constructive solutions. So if you'll indulge me in just kind of walking through a few things. And I think it's also important too, this is not about being partisan. And I don't presume that we are of a like mind in this room. In fact, I presume that we are not. And it's not about being Democrat or Republican or anything. I think, though, it is about being honest about the fact that we have a polarized environment that is often framed around political affiliation, and then that is getting in the way of us actually having conversations with one another. And so, if this is a hard conversation series, let's talk about the barriers to having conversation. One is we are increasingly polarized and what it even means to identify as blue or red, for example. And it used to be that we weren't as divided. This is just 1994, where we were a lot closer together. And even in 2004, there wasn't as much of a disparity. In the last 10 years, studies show that people have pulled apart in even what the median looks like in political affiliation. So it means that we are broader apart in what we think the solutions might be, and even what we define as the problem. I think this is interesting too. And again, this isn't about the numbers as much as it is about the fact that there's a significant number of people on both sides who think the other side is a threat to the nation's well-being. I think, again, when we see this, I've seen, the vitriol and and really seething comments that just feel so angry to me. Sure, and one of the things I wanted to go back to here is, there's so much data. Pew Charitable Trust, by the way, does great research on attitudes, and they've got a whole area of political attitudes in the country. So playing around on Google and at Pew Research is really great. It'll yield a lot of this kind of information. But research shows we don't want to marry people or date people out of our political affiliation. We don't want to live near people who don't think like we do. Our friends, we don't want to think differently than us. We are increasingly in our social media circles, in like-minded spaces, and we are increasingly not able to understand how to communicate constructively when we're faced with something we don't agree with. And so I think this is a barrier. And so one of the things, these are just, I had like 15 of these charts, and I just was like, okay, you can't put them all out. But, but again, this is the kind of thing where it gets into a theme, is that we're polarized to the point where we don't talk to one another, we don't relate to one another, we're not getting together with one another anymore. That's a problem. One of the things that I was really interested to discover, we have something in common. I'm from Maryland, and so that's, and in Baltimore in particular. This is my congressional district, actually. I am in the Maryland 3rd District, which is consistently ranked the #1 most gerrymandered political district in the country. We like to think that it looks like a bird in the middle of the state, because it's got like these two wings. But this is the congressional 33rd in Texas, in south of here, South Dallas. And this stretches down to Fort Worth. So again, you see, different things, but I found this interesting, but is endemic to the fact that increasingly we don't pick our politicians. Our politicians have actually picked us. And this, again, is on all sides. And this has changed dramatically in the last 30, 35 years, where now 60% of Americans live in landslide counties where one party consistently wins by 20 percentage points or more. I feel like this is also part of what has polarized people to the point where, in many cases, when you talk with folks, they say, I don't really identify so much with my elected officials, but I don't identify with the other folks either. Like, most Americans are not that polarized, or they don't identify so ideologically, but yet our political structure does. And I think partly gerrymandering is one of the most boring public policy issues ever when you get down into it, but I think this is a real problem. It undergirds all of our conversations. And then talking about polarizing. So this is a really interesting piece. This is about how we have stopped talking to one another. I find it interesting here. 13% of Americans have said they've ended a relationship with a family member or close friend in the last year because of politics. And let's see, because of this election, I've had at least one argument with a family or friend. Almost 40% of Americans have said, yeah, I've had an argument over this. I'm curious, just raise your hands, how many people here have had a significant relationship in their life negatively impacted because of politics or the election? And again, it doesn't matter which side, it's just the fact that it has divided us even from people that we love. And I've heard so many people say, my brother, my mother, my daughter, my best friend, all of this. And you hear the sadness because people are like, wow, that hurt when they said or when they did or I felt. And I'm thinking, we're alienating each other here from the people that we love and we hurt because of it. And I think that's sad. And I feel like we gotta talk about it. Okay, so that's polarized. Let's talk about unhappy. I'm not Debbie Downer normally, by the way. So let's talk about all the terrible things that are wrong with us, but then let's talk about like some of the good stuff too. So I think we're unhappy, right? Part of it is we got 40 million people living in poverty, but we got a lot of people who really don't feel like they're swimming in cash. 60% of Americans have no emergency savings or have less than $1,000 in the bank. And so when you feel constantly economically strained, that's stressful. And we see that in the people that we serve, but this is a lot of Americans. And you remember from income distribution video, there's a lot of people in the middle class who aren't that far apart from the poor. And what's also interesting, do you know that 70% of Americans identify as middle class? Just when you think about that? Anyway, okay. What it means to be middle class is very interesting. We're taking a lot of pills. I think we've gotten a lot of attention about pills, but it's just antidepressants too, up 400% in the last decade. Lots of research that show we are chronically stressed out, and we have anxiety and depression, road rage. I mean, like all of these things we're seeing go up and up and up, right? We're not taking even the vacations that we get if we get vacations. So these are issues that are contributing to stress. Historic trust in government. I wasn't around in 1958, but wow, like what was happening like in the late 50s that like nearly 80% of Americans thought, yeah, government, like most of the time we trust government to do what's right. And take a look at how we have changed. We're now down to less than 20% of the public thinks that the government would do right. And this is on both sides. I find this fascinating. So again, when we talk about like what alienates us, public policy is going to be solved or determined by public systems. If we don't have trust in those public systems, where do we go from there? I think if there's anything that indicates unhappiness, it's suicide rates. We're seeing suicide rates go up across the country in all race groups. And then, if anything, again, we're doing a lot of drugs in this country. And this is the increase in overdose deaths since 1980. And so this includes opioids, but is not exclusive to it. But literally, 65,000 people died of a drug overdose in 2016. And this is the trajectory. What is it that we are seeking in substance use? I feel like you talk with a lot of people who either have addiction issues or people who just use drugs but maybe not addicted. Again, a lot of space in there. But what is it that we are seeking with caffeine and pills and food and alcohol and drugs? What are we looking for? And I feel like we're unhappy. Okay, curious, how many people here today read something in the news that made them angry? Okay, all right, great. So you guys are all folding in, okay. All right, and then we blame one another. Again, Pew Research Center does great work here. So this is the kind of thing that I think also divides us. So we have very different views in this country about how people behave, or why people are poor, or why people are rich, why people are successful or not. So looking at this, again, and this isn't about right or wrong. This is about just different perspectives, I think, on key issues that get in the way of us then talking about what the solution is. So for example, why is a person rich? So about half and half either worked harder or people had advantages in life. Or why is a person poor? A third of people said a lack of effort. And over half of people said circumstances beyond control. Okay. When you divide that out by political affiliation, you almost see a very opposite perspective. So this idea of why is a person poor, over half of some folks say it's a lack of effort, or, again, this idea of what causes problems. Why are people poor? If we're going to address poverty, we have to have a discussion about why people are poor. Well, working harder is one perspective, but it is not shared by a lot of folks. So it's just thinking about that. And I think we've got an emerging dichotomy of the deserving versus the undeserving poor. And so we set up categories and definitions and things that are acceptable or not acceptable, or if you do this or if you do that, or you deserve help but you don't deserve help. And where does that go? I think the failure to expand Medicaid I know you thought I wasn't going to come back to it, but I did. Okay, so the failure to expand Medicaid in 19 states in this country, I do think is endemic of this idea of those folks don't deserve health care. And that is part of a discussion, and part of that, you see that element there. Work requirements and drug testing, these are not requirements that are put on all Americans, they're put on poor Americans. Restrictions for felons, again, we restrict, there's a lot, and I know you've had discussions about the criminal justice system. So what is it that we do? We deny them housing, we deny them jobs, and we deny them education. So what do people do when you have a felony? Especially when we've set up a system that pretty much ensures a good section of this country is going to have a criminal justice background. So we've got stereotypes that don't match reality, but they really are stubborn, they dig in. And we've got violence and threats and fear. Again, I'm going to talk about fear. Try going to a community meeting and suggesting that there be, a housing project that be located like anywhere within 100 miles. Again, that's fear to me. And so thinking through what that looks like, I think is part of the conversation. Another Pew chart, again, I love these things. Question here. Poor people have hard lives because government benefits don't go far enough to help them live decently. So that's this perspective here in the orange. Or poor people today have it easy because they can get government benefits without doing anything in return. So that's on the right. And again, this is separated out not by politics, but by income. And so one of the things I find interesting is that it's not like poor folks have all of the same perspective. People are people, no matter how much they earn, and they're going to have disagreements about that. But you do see that over 50% of people earning $50,000 a year or more think that poor people have it easy because they can get benefits without doing anything in return. And again, I think a lot of it is when in the service industry, we see how hard it is to get people benefits, and then you see a conversation about poor people, can just get anything they want, and it feels like people are living in a different reality. And it's not to delegitimize either one as much as to point out that it roots us in different places to the point where it's hard to talk to one another. Okay, so blame. So one of the things I find interesting is we talk a lot about Section 8 housing. Well, why should I subsidize those people's houses? Okay, I love those people. So anytime those people is a term, you always know you're in trouble if someone throws out the term those people. One of the things I find fascinating is that many of us are subsidized in ways that we don't consider subsidies. My health care comes from my employer. My health care is subsidized by the federal government. If your health care comes from your employer, your health care is subsidized by the federal government. 55% of this country gets their health care from their employer. 55% of this country's health care is subsidized by the federal government through tax-free health care, and it is the #1 tax credit. So one of the things that we think about is $144 billion a year goes into offsetting employer-sponsored health care. I think that's something we just have to be honest about. Now, I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong or either way. I'm just saying, is it the same? I feel like I'm subsidized. Taking a look down, these are the 10 biggest tax credits in the country. What I find interesting too is, again, coming to Section 8 housing, we spend $77 billion a year on the mortgage interest deduction. Most of that goes to upper income households. My housing is subsidized through the federal government. And if you get a mortgage interest deduction, your housing is subsidized from the federal government. And I just feel like I want us to be honest about what does a subsidy mean? To say I shouldn't have to pay for because you're poor. Fill in the blank, whatever that is. Can we take a hard look at how the system is paying for what we all have? I got a Pell Grant. I got student loans. But people don't think about me as being subsidized, but I am. Lots of us are. Okay, I violated the rule about only putting one chart on the slide at a time, and we're coming down to the end of charts, by the way, so if you're charted out, you're in luck. However, I think it's important to put these things next to one another. So let's talk about housing subsidy, because I think so much of what we do is driven by a lack of housing. This is the housing expenditures at the federal level. And this is how much we spend on home ownership in the country. It's about $140 billion a year. Most of this, we had mentioned the $77 billion for mortgage interest deduction, but you get real estate tax deductions, capital gains exclusions on real estate, and a few other things. This all goes to home ownership. This is how much we spend on rental subsidies and housing assistance in this country. Section 8 is about $30 billion a year, so less than half of what we spend on mortgage interest deduction. Put on top of that low-income housing tax credit, a little bit of public housing, a few other things, and it comes into about $45 billion a year. There's a vast disparity between where we are putting the money that we are spending on housing, where are we putting it? And then when we look at where we're putting it, let's take a look at who gets it. This is a chart here of the household incomes of where we are spending housing subsidies. We spend $15 billion a year in housing for households less than $10,000. We spend $85 billion a year on households that earn $100,000 or more a year. A vastly disproportionate amount of our housing tax assist, like all the money that goes into housing, vast majority of it goes to upper income households. And the vast majority of people who are at the lower income, who are not getting as much, are renters, and most of these are homeowners. And a lot of the mortgage interest deduction goes into second houses. So again, these are the kinds of things that I just feel like we have to know in order to have an honest and hard conversation about what it means to be subsidized in your housing in this country. Okay, Debbie Downer is kind of getting old and feeling the weight. So, okay, things we can do. This is where I think I would like to move forward. All right, how do we talk to one another? How do we put the pieces together? And forgive me for sounding a little hippie here, but how do we bring more joy and happiness into the work and into our community and into our lives? Because I feel like we're really stressed out, and I feel like we need to focus a little bit more on loving each other. So let's talk a little bit about that, and then let's have a talk. So first, how many people here know most of their neighbors by name? Okay, you guys are a tight group. How many people here would say they hardly know any of their neighbors by name? Okay, so about what we're seeing here. One of the things I find interesting, and when I work in a healthcare for the homeless clinic, and so I talk with a lot of consumers, I talk with a lot of providers, and one of the things when I talk with consumers, I say, what is it that you would like to see? And invariably, people say, it would just be great if someone would talk to me like a human being. If they wouldn't cross the street when they see me coming, or say hi to me, or not be mean to me, or spit on me, or call me names, or all these things. And I think that's telling. But I also think it's telling, they find it surprising, no one talks to one another. Like, you don't talk to your neighbors, you don't talk to the people that live next door to you. I find that interesting. We're losing community in this country. I think that that's important to talk about. So how do we get outside our usual set of friends? How do we kind of get outside maybe even an echo chamber of one or the other, that whole bit, and how do we build skills? I'm curious, how many people, service providers, how many people here have been trained in motivational interviewing? Okay, so this is a style of communication where you really try to seek to establish common goals, elicit what's really important to somebody. It's a clinical intervention and an evidence-based practice, but one that I think can really be instructive for us as people in just reaching out and saying, hey, how do we talk with one another that's not confrontational, but seeks to really elicit commonalities and what we're mutually interested in? I think there's a lot of things we are interested in, but there's a lot of noise in getting there. All right, things we can do. So I think so many people have said, I just stopped watching the news, I've dropped out, I've tuned out, it just makes me too angry, I just can't do it. But I feel like this is the time to be active and engaged, because I feel like this is an opportunity for us to really be, again, impassioned times call for impassioned responses, and an opportunity to be connected. Opportunity for us to really say, hey, this is what I would like to see in my community. Let's have constructive conversations about where we go. How do we link the issue of homelessness to these bigger contextual issues? Stop talking about homelessness as the problem and talking about homelessness as the outgrowth of the problem. This is when we don't address issues, homelessness exists. And we can put all the money and all the effort into creating a homeless industrial complex. We've chosen that. And that's good work that a lot of people here are doing, but wouldn't it be great if we could focus on other stuff? Okay, one of the things too I thought was interesting is a lot of people say, you know what, it's just too much, I feel overwhelmed. I don't know anyone who's not overwhelmed. Does anyone here know anyone who's not overwhelmed? And so I feel like when we're overwhelmed and we're stressed out, and it just becomes too much, we're not effective in what we're doing, and it feels hard to do more at a time when people are asking us to do more. And so then we get overwhelmed and we tune out and we drop out. I think one thing is we need to take a breath and we need to say, you know what? You can't do everything, and no one is singularly responsible for fixing the problem. So let's cut ourselves as individuals a little bit of a break. At the same time, thinking about what is our role? What's my individual role? For example, we need everybody in the community. Lots of people bring lots of different skills and lots of different roles. And one of the things that I love, I work with consumer movements, and I also work with boards of directors, and I work with public policy people, and they all bring something very different. And sometimes when I'm at an event, there'll be like a demonstration outside, whereas inside, you've got like the people at the table. Everyone there plays a role, but they're not the same role, and one person doesn't have to be in all of those roles. The CEO is generally not the guy who's waving the sign in the street outside the door with the bullhorn. Generally not, I'm not saying it couldn't happen. But Cindy, I see Cindy doing that, for example, but that's an anomaly. So the part of it is that but everyone has a strategic value there. You need the demonstrations in the street so that the conversation at the table can happen. And they're not going to be the same people, but they all serve a role. And so how is it that we just strategically use the roles that we have in our community? Again, not presuming that everyone has the same position or would be engaged in the same demonstration, but it is to acknowledge ask yourselves, where is my role here? What do I feel like I lend most into? And then where are my skills best used? You need everybody talking and telling a story and making connections. So you don't have to do everything, but if you can write an op-ed, or if you are a photographer, or if you're a board member, again, lots of different things that people can bring to this, even if it's just putting up a window sign or a bumper sticker or wearing a bunch of buttons, or just being present for the values that you would like to see in a community. I'm going to leave this up for just a minute. So here's also talking to your federal representatives. And it's, again, I don't presume that we are of like mind in this room, I assure you. And no doubt you'll be calling your representative and telling them all kinds of stuff that's going to be very different than your neighbor. At the same time, an engaged populace is the very point of a democracy. And when people drop out, you no longer have a democracy. A democracy is specifically fueled by the will of the people. But it takes everyone to be engaged. Dictatorships are extraordinarily easy and they're extraordinarily efficient. Democracies are messy and they're hard. And it requires us to shove our shoulder in. And I think it's hard to do when it feels so acrimonious. Especially when you're fighting with your wife over, or your husband over the election, for example. It's hard to really feel engaged. But plug these numbers into your phone. Because you can just speed dial your congressman, and it's important to do so. A lot of people don't know this, but in the congressional offices, the aides have a log, and they are logging the calls that come in. And so, and usually, and particularly on hot button issues, like the healthcare bill or immigration issues or something like that, literally they are taking tallies as people call in. And so just calling and saying, hey, it takes 10 seconds. And actually, half the time you'll leave a message on the voicemail, if you can even get through, because a lot of times they're overloaded, which is why I included their local numbers as well, because those are very rarely overloaded. You can call your local office. They're going to take that tally too, and then they'll send it to the DC office. So, and I understand that this area is split districts, so you might need to know whether Bernice or Eddie Bernice Johnson or Pete Sessions is your member. So yeah, plug these into your phone, call them on your drive, your hands-free, device, of course. Or, again, just dialing direct. It actually will make you feel better. I promise, if you call your member, you will feel better. It doesn't even matter what you say. You will feel better. There's something about that. I don't know what it is. But when you get to express your opinion to people who are decision makers, that's an empowered democracy. Oh, by the way, I know people have been scribbling. We're going to send these slides, and so they'll get posted on the website. So if you just want to download these at another time, that's great. Okay, things we can do. Finding joy in our work. So I'm in the healthcare business. The Institute for Healthcare Improvement is a pretty mainstream place. They are focused on quality and data. They came out with a framework for improving joy in work. And I thought, if IHI is like focused on joy, then this has now got to be okay to talk about. Because this is pretty mainstream. But it's focused on talking about what matters to us in our work and focusing on that, creating environments that focus on what matters to us and achieving where we want to go. And whether it's this or what have you, I feel like talking to one another, feeling out where people want to be, where we have areas of agreement. But I just feel like when we talk about homelessness as the problem, we get dug in to the place where we can't move forward because we're so polarized. And I feel like there's a place there where we want more information, but we also would love to have more common spaces. So like for example, healthcare. I think that we could talk for a long time about how healthcare is organized, financed, and delivered in this country. And there's a lot of very valid approaches on all sides. But we're not having that conversation. Why can't we? I feel like we want it. So again, I think that there's a lot here to talk about. But at the end of the day, I feel like we can't end homelessness by ending homelessness, because we need to turn off the tap into the tub and to ask homeless service providers at the end of the line to end homelessness while we give them very little resources to do so is an impossible task. One that I think a lot of people here are focused on doing every day, and God bless them. But we can't think that we're going to end it until we've truly addressed systemic issues. So thank you for coming to this hard conversation. This is the end of my monologue. I'm really curious, though, what you guys think about putting these pieces together and where you think is important to focus. And so we've got half an hour left. Oh, okay, I'm going to put a mic here. So if we're going to do like one by one. Okay.
Is it on?
It is.
It's on. Hi everybody, my name is Christopher, and I'm a homeless man that currently lives up at the bridge. I guess in a way I'm becoming more of a advocate for the homeless people within the city of Dallas, and what I see is a big crack in the concrete. Like downtown, what I see, when it comes to housing, everything downtown is being rebuilt into a luxury high-rise, $1,200 a month for rent. Well, how about taking some of those buildings and refurbishing them into for housing for the homeless? Yeah, that would be kind of nice. I mean, you don't really have to create luxury, but just create housing. At least that would kind of help eliminate some of the problems of people that just continue to go around in the cycle. I am upstairs in transitional housing up at the bridge, and I'm waiting for my housing. To me, it all starts with having a good care manager at the bridge. You have to be open and honest. You have to have that rapport with your care manager. It's not one of these where they're just going to blow smoke up your butt. I mean, if they ask you to do something, take care of it, get it done, and you can move up along in the system. But what I see as a homeless person, there needs to be a lot of changes for the city, and I'm willing and ready to become an advocate and start a petition for the homeless people, for the city of Dallas to be able to hear us. You know, we are a person, we're not just a number. And in order for us to end homelessness, you have to understand people that are homeless, and you have to have the right programs for people like us in order to be able to move in the system. But there's so many people that wanna, but you gotta start somewhere. Like I said, I'm just a person, but I'm moving through the system, and you have to be willing to work in order to get to where you wanna go. Like I said, I'm willing to be an advocate for the homeless person and just be able to talk to the city of Dallas, look at the council members and stuff. So, I'm done. Thank you for having me.
My name is Robert Ceccarelli. I would say I'm the most advertised, publicized homeless person in North Dallas, North Texas, and the most expensive. I've been in newspapers, CBS 11 News. I like what she had to say at the end, and I'm here on a very serious issue right now. Protesting and elected officials. She's very on the money about protesting, and I'm having a problem with downstairs in the auditorium to have a homeless meeting with only the homeless people to speak out. I would hope you get behind me on this very, very seriously. As you can see, there's only one homeless person at this meeting. I've been having problems for years for homeless people to attend meetings and to speak. I'm the direct source. I'll let you know right now, the direct source. Also, elected officials. Now, one elected official is here. They know all about it, especially city council. There's about 4 or 5 of them that should be here, but they're not here at all. See, that is a major problem with you being here. It's not going to help anything. We got to break this wide open. I'm very, very serious about this, and the city of Dallas has refused to cooperate in this matter. I repeat, I'm the direct source. Also, one more thing is that I was on CBS 11 News, Robbie Owens interview. None of you saw the interview last February. I was leading the 5 o'clock news. Only way to get out of housing, into housing, is I go to jail on purpose. Merle's here, and Moga were just here. They will tell you the funding for housing is through jail. I do misdemeanors. I call on myself to get arrested. If I did not do that, I would have been dead here today. So it's so bad about housing. The funding is through the jail, and you get it right away when you get out. I've had many, many months of housing right now because of me going to jail. But I need your help to participate in front of city council and county commissioners to speak up. She talks about it, but nobody ever does it except me and Richard Sheridan. You need to speak up. Forget about being elbows to everybody. Speak up and tell the problems. If not, nothing's going to happen, and you're just going to clap and do nothing about it. But I need your help in getting a homeless meeting, only the homeless, down at the auditorium in the near future. But they refuse to help me, and please speak up about it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's important we have all voices present. So let's see, sir, you've been standing here for a minute, so do you have something to say? Okay, good, and then we'll go to you, sir, and then you. Okay.
All right. Yeah, I just wanted to say something. I thought that was a really good socio-economic presentation that you did. It was impressive. I don't know how much it had to do with homelessness, but because I'm not convinced that economics is the main problem. Actually, I just want to give my name's Matthew Wilson. I've been in and out of homelessness for decades, okay? I don't want to even run down the whole list here, but I've been homeless in New York, Boston, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., up and down both coasts of Florida, Atlanta, Nashville, Dallas, San Antonio, Providence, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, Washington, Raleigh.
You're an expert. It sounds like a
yes,
Johnny Cash song, doesn't it?
I have credentials probably nobody else has, okay? But what I was going to say, and you just went to Nashville, where you said you had a conference, and that you probably learned about the Room in the Inn.
Yeah.
It's one of the major programs. I was there in 1986, 7, 8, 9, and helped Charles Strobel build that program. Anyway, it's very successful. It's a good program. It's a good thing. Anyway, what I was going to say is one of the things I think that's happening here is I agreed with your initial statement, which was that we're not ending homelessness. What was it here? It says,
It is right here. Can end homelessness by ending
you
homelessness?
can't, no, not that one,
No,
the
that
first
one?
one.
Oh.
We aren't really ending homelessness because we're focused on all the wrong things. That was the initial
Yep.
statement on the thing, which I believe was correct, except I knew I was going to disengage somewhere from you. I could just tell. But
I mean,
anyway,
people do.
you're a
I get it.
professional. But anyway, but I just had to say this. Okay, most homeless programs are founded based on the theory that there's only either bad luck or mental illness going on. Okay, so counseling and housing are thought to be the main answers to it. So consequently, hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on these things. Okay, also medication supposes that the medical people know how to diagnose properly and or honestly when many factors are actually at work in the healthcare industry. Witness the opioid crisis. Anyway, what I wanted to say was I think this really breaks down. I'm just going to throw this out here real quick because I think that I think you can break this in. Homeless people will all fall into one of these four categories. Okay, I thought it was 3 too, but since then I've decided, it's 4. Okay. Anyway, so let me start here. Let's say first hard luck. Okay, people have lost a job, their marriage fell apart, they had ill luck, health problems. Okay, but the point is they've had maintenance, they have had jobs, they have had responsible lives. They do know how to do it. They want back into it. They need some help. They probably don't even want that, but that's a real thing. Okay, the other thing is the mental illness, which I also would include retarded, slow people who really just do not have the capacity to keep up with the world and on an even daily, regular basis. Okay, so that's all of that mental health thing. And some of these are diagnosed, some of them are not diagnosed, and we all know about the thing where in the 80s and 90s they started putting people out, the beds all disappeared, all of these institutions, and they decided we're going to medicate people and put them on the street, and they'll be okay. Well, there they are, and lots of them are not okay. But another one here that I think is missed is that there's a lot of homeless people, they like it. It's an exciting, adventuresome lifestyle, and they just don't want the rote and it's boring to just live a work-a-day world. So the point is they choose. Actually, a lot of your vets fall into this category because I have a lot of friends who are vets, and that they choose it. You can give them this help and that help, and then they'll come right to homelessness because they understand it. They can do that. It gives them the opportunities and the satisfaction that they want in their personal integrity. And then there's another, the last group I'm going to say, which I think a lot of people in this room are going to get upset that I'm going to say this, but it is the criminal element. The fact that there is people in the world. This is really more a spiritual breakdown almost than a mental breakdown. But the criminal element is that there's people who've just decided that the world owes them something and they're going to take it. They're not going to ask, the world owes them something. And I think a lot of people have decided we can't use that as part of the criteria. But when you put that out as part of the criteria, you're never going to solve that part of the problem if you can't admit that that's what they are, and that's what they will always keep coming back to. Anyway, I just wanted to say that, and there's other things, but it's good that you had this, and I thought it was very telling what he said, that there's no actual elected representatives here.
Thank you, sir.
We don't care.
Again, I think it's important that we have all voices be here. Sir?
Okay, I'll be brief. My name is Eddie Pratt, and I'm actually from the DC area also. I moved here in 2011, and currently I work for an organization called Anthem Strong Families, and I'm also a pastor here. I think that one of the major causes of homelessness is the breakdown of the family. It's the absence of the father. When there's an absence of the father, it breaks down the family, and then it causes the tentacles of homelessness. And let me share why this is so. Just in my own personal experience, when I lived in DC, I owned a business, and it was very thriving. And so I had 7 locations of an auto business, an auto detailing business that was in Bethesda, in parts of DC, and office buildings. And so in that, there was a hole inside of me because I was only thinking about the money. I wasn't thinking about my family. I wasn't thinking about the things that are important. Now, as a result of that greed, I was more separated kind of from my dad. My dad and I were close, but then we were distant in some very critical areas of my life. And so I began trying to fill this emptiness with stuff, and I ended up homeless. I have 7 children. 6 of them are girls, which is why I have no hair. And I ended up homeless after I came to Dallas. So I asked myself, how, in that process, how did I, someone that graduated from Morehouse College, has had education, a business, all of these different things, how in the world did I end up in a transitional house with my daughters, 4 of them? So through divorce and all of that kind of stuff, and I'm not here to bash anybody else, I had to take a look at and go through counseling that would address me and what was the hole inside of me that led me to not deal with the reality that I was creating. So when you spoke about the talking to each other, I think there's something that needs to happen. There has to be a process of talking to ourselves and talking with someone else about self-assessment, because a lot of people live 2 paychecks away from being homeless. I mean, they have nice cars, nice places, nice clothes. Now, when I went through that process, and now I pastor and mentor over at Dallas Life every week, but I think that what has helped me in the engagement with people that are homeless is because I had to go through it. And I had to go through it as a single father. And then I had to rebuild those relationships with my children. But something had to be rebuilt in me first. And then I was able to rebuild my relationship with all of my children, get back into the workforce, and see what the responsibility of the money was actually for. It wasn't for me to buy stuff and buy all of those cars that I used to have and travel all of the time. There's nothing wrong with nice stuff as long as it's in the proper order. And it wasn't until I learned that, but I didn't learn that from the family structure. So the dismantling and the division of family, I think, has a lot to do with the creation of homelessness, is because there is not that family bond, there is not that communication, there's that division of I'm going to get mine, you get yours. And when you suffer, I'm not giving you any of mine. I can speak to that because I was that way. I had 7 automobiles at one time. If one of my family members wanted to use one of them, I'd act like I couldn't hear the phone, couldn't see them. I would drive by people that I could have helped. I had people working for me that I taught them how to make money, but I did not teach them how to relate and engage with their own families. And I was part of the problem with them because I had them working so much that they were separated from their families, because that's what I was doing, because that's what I was taught to do. When the nucleus of the family is not intact, I think it has so much to do with this whole homelessness issue. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Charles Mann. I'm a year away from where the gentleman was who was first up here. He is at the bridge now waiting on transitional housing. I've been through that. I was there last year, and I am now in transitional housing. I'm now in my own place. And it's a daunting process that you have to go through, but it's available and it's worthwhile. The problem is, as you said at the beginning, we can't look at this problem from the ground up. We have to look at it from 50,000 feet above and down, and pierce through the upper layer that's holding back progress at our level. Those names you put up of the council members, the senators, Those 4 names, I gotta tell you, lady, those 4 names are worthless. Because those people have absolutely no interest in what's going on with poor people. We don't provide them any funding, we don't provide them any resources. All they're interested in is our vote. Once they've got that, we're history. So those names, I wouldn't say are of any great value. That's my personal opinion. The real problem is, you had another slide up here that said something about we need to increase the vouchers, the availability of vouchers. What good does it do to hand somebody a voucher if nobody will accept it? The big problem is that we need to find a way to enforce the opportunity to use these vouchers. If people won't accept them, it's just a worthless piece of paper.
Completely agree.
Okay? That's about all I've got to say. Now, thank you. Thank you.
Great presentation, great holistic presentation, very good. Richard Sheridan, 14-year homeless advocate, City Hall, Commissioners Court, school system, 3,700 homeless students, imagine that.
41, Dallas ISD.
Right. Licensed professional engineer, I know about numbers. The elephant in the room is the need for emergency shelter. There's no question housing first is the way to go. Get them in a safe place. No question about that. But permanent supportive housing will only address about 20% of the need. The greatest need is emergency shelters. As an example, we have a need for 5,000 shelter beds in the city of Dallas. You look at 10 or 12,000 homeless people, men, women, children, veterans, etc. We're only sheltering about 3,500 of them with the 5 shelters, also Street Shelter, Day Resource Center, or Dallas Life, Salvation Army. I look at the Orchard Street Shelter, $15 a day will basically provide them a bed. If you add that up in Dallas County, it's 5 cents per person per day. 5 cents, can we afford 5 cents per person per day? I believe we can. So again, housing first, but the biggest need in that housing is emergency shelters. Thank you very much.
One question too is, and I think this is an important piece, because we get stuck at the local level on where do you focus? Do you focus on the people who are in the tub right now? I need emergency shelter beds, because we've got people living on the street. At the same time, does that really end? Emergency shelters aren't housing, and emergency shelters don't end homelessness. They are part of a crisis response system, but we continue to perpetuate the crisis. And I find that to be part of the hard rub at the local community level, because then everybody here ends up getting torn between, do we meet immediate needs that we're here now, or do we have a longer term vision? And you have such little money to do anything that you've got to pick and choose when you need all of it. And that's the rub. I think that's what's frustrating. So every time, I think part of the question, the response is, when people say, what are you doing to solve the homeless problem? The only real answer is, what are you doing to solve the housing problem? There's plenty of people with substance abuse issues and mental health issues in this country who are perfectly well housed. And there's plenty of people with convictions who are perfectly well housed. There is something about the housing piece that is undermining lots of people and getting them into the street. And people are coming in, and we've heard a lot of testimony. People find their way into this through a lot of different, but there's a common element here. It's poverty and lack of housing. And it's frustrating, and it tears us apart because we're left to figure out what to do with the pieces. Cindy, you would, one more question? Oh. Maybe if we're quick, we can get 2.
I'll be quick.
Well, we got like 6 minutes left, sir.
All right.
And then you right after. Okay.
I don't have a question. I just want to introduce myself. I'm Ken Webb. I'm the chair of the Dallas Citizen Homeless Commission. So I'm not an elected official, but it's a volunteer position. But But we are intended to be access for the citizens of Dallas for input on this issue. I think there's a lot of great things said today. We have a lot of complex and overlapping issues to address, but one of the key things that Barbara said was we need to communicate, we need to listen to each other, we need to establish a sense of community. It would be arrogant of me and my commission to think that persons who actually are experiencing or have experienced homelessness don't have a lot of valuable things to say. So I'm going to be bringing a proposal to my commission at our next meeting that we have a public comment period in all future meetings. And I'd be interested in, if there are other meetings that Mr. Ciccarelli or others organize to address the issue, I would love to be invited to those. We need to have a very open and transparent dialogue about this, and we'll kind of work together to solve these issues as we go forward.
Wait, this is the last one, sorry. No, please.
No. So I really appreciated your talk because it highlights kind of the intersectionality of different policies, and I appreciate particularly the slide, but one of the frustrating things that I find is that our policymakers, particularly at the federal level, don't really understand that homelessness is just the outcome of all these other problems, right? And so how do we get them to more comprehensively look at social policy and how the pieces fit together? Because even when I talk to them, right, they'll send me to the legislative aid that only does healthcare or the legislative aid that does housing. And even though they're in the same office and those things go together, they don't really understand that. So how do we get them to understand that?
Well, that's a $50 million question. That's another hard conversation. One that I'm happy to have, by the way. Just determination and continue doing it, because part of it is, again, I think there's been a couple of people who have said that, like, they don't feel like this is an outlet for being heard. However, I guess I have to ask, in a democracy, we've got to come back to, these are the folks that represent us. They represent us. They represent all of us, and we just have to keep, so everywhere they go, I mean, it's, you know, is it you and is it 50 of your friends? How is it that they are forced to look at the issues that we are seeing because they are our representatives? And I get it. I mean, like, it's, when you feel like your representative does not represent you, that is an alienating feeling. And as we don't like feeling that as Americans. At the same time, how do we participate in a democracy if we're not continuing to really make and push the effort? How do we call and write and demonstrate and continue to be present and force them to look at this issue? One thing, too, that I think is important to note, I do a lot of work in DC. What we see in front of the cameras and the conversation that happens politically is very different than the conversation that happens off camera. And I would argue that on all sides, there's a lot of kabuki theater, kind of, very extremist or very resolute positions that are being put. It's a much more nuanced conversation. And so part of it is, how do we participate in the more nuanced conversation that's not in the limelight, but is really rolling up your sleeves and having those discussions? And it's not easy, and it feels alienating. But I guess part of it is, what's the alternative? Because we can't just tune out, because then what's the point of a democracy? And I feel like one thing that is kind of a common interest is that we are committed to a democracy in this country. I feel like this has taken a whole different turn. And maybe I've set up the next hard conversation on how to do this, which would be really great too.
Come back.
I am super excited about so many people coming during the middle of the day for a conversation on homelessness. You guys have been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll continue the conversation. I'm hoping you're enjoying this series. Our next hard conversation is going to be the woman I met many, many years ago, a woman with lived experience in homelessness who's now an amazing leader, an amazing speaker, Miss Joyce Grandgent. And there's a flyer on it in the back. She'll be here on Thursday, December 7th, and our intent is to be in the library. You all, thank you very much, and continue the dialogue. Thank you.
Excuse me. This is William, hopefully your favorite videographer from Two Hats Publishing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please leave comments below, or like, follow, or subscribe to us and get notices of all our videos. We love it, even when you call.